Irish Nation, welcome to the show. Notre Dame improves to 6-1 on the season, taking down the Georgia Tech Ramblin' Wreck in a pretty dominating performance in Atlanta, Georgia, 31-13. It's 31-7 before a garbage touchdown late. Mike, has it been 3 weeks, 4 weeks since we've done a show together? Well, welcome back from Europe. How you doing? And good to be with you again, man.
Thanks. Good to be back in the swing of things. Get back into the college football routine. I got back from a trip to Paris, and then one of my friends got married in Marbella, Spain. So I was out for a couple weeks. One of the weeks was a bye week, so I didn't miss any Notre Dame football. The last week it was actually the Stanford game. I watched about half of that, but I think it was like 2 or 3 in the morning Paris time, and I basically just like fell asleep by halftime. But it was pretty clear that we were winning, and I watched the rest of it when I got back home. But yeah, it's great. Like I said, great to be back. Great to be back in the swing of things. Got to watch Notre Dame get another victory this weekend. So yeah, from my standpoint, vibes are good right now. Feeling good.
Awesome. Well, I am traveling for work. If you're on YouTube, you can see I'm sitting here in a hotel room out in Colorado. So Mike and I are a little bit closer now, only one time zone away, not three. But we're going to keep tonight's show pretty simple. We're going to walk through the Georgia Tech game and then look ahead to the Navy matchup next week. And then excited for next week, we have a surprise guest on the show. We're going to save it till real time, but we're going to unveil our surprise guest for next week's show, and thinking about getting a couple other topics here into the fold on evaluating big picture themes, like as we're even prepping for this show, and I'm sure you'll hear it as we go through the Georgia Tech game. Just how historically great is this defense for Al Golden and Notre Dame, and think it's worth stepping back and putting some historical context around it. But for purposes of today's show, Mike, what another dominating performance by this defense. A 20% havoc rate, a 32% success rate. So, both of those are above average for Notre Dame on the season, which is shocking to say for how good this team has been. Just 1 in 3 plays was Georgia Tech able to stay on schedule, and just felt like really after that one long touchdown drive that they had early. I mean, it was overwhelming is the word I just kept thinking, where Georgia Tech just looked overwhelmed by the Notre Dame defense.
Totally agree. We had a little bit of a slow start, which it's been a theme for us so far this year. Brett, you and Michael talked about it last week, but really once we got past some of the kind of figuring out what Georgia Tech was doing on offense, the defense really settled in, and you hit these headline stats. We really weren't giving them anything. 32% success rate. You're really not going to be able to put up points when you're converting not even a third of your plays as successful plays, and then 20% havoc. It's great to see this continued theme of our havoc, reaching such high levels, because we called that out as an area earlier in the year that we weren't doing particularly well in. And then really, I think it's the last like 4 weeks or so, we have really emerged, and we've just been extremely disruptive, whether it's the defensive line, the defensive backs, whether it's tackles for loss, sacks, interceptions. It's pretty much been across the board. And so not only have we not been allowing teams to stay on schedule, but we've just been putting them in really difficult situations with these high impact plays. And even from an explosiveness standpoint, I would say we generally have not been giving a ton there either. So really, any way you want to analyze our defense right now, they are just excelling, and you see that in the SP Plus right now. So Brett and I, we made a prediction at the beginning of the year where we thought this defense was going to end up by the end of the year, and currently right now we're number 5. We're number 5 in SP Plus for defense, which is telling us exactly what we expected to see. This is an elite defense, and we think there's a chance for this defense to do even better, even with these injuries. We think we have a shot to potentially be a top 3 defense. Maybe number 1. It's going to be tougher with these injuries, as I said, but overall, this is about as elite a defense as I've seen from Notre Dame.
Absolutely. And, look, I had Ben Morrison as the MVP of this team. Anyone who's been listening to this show has heard me sing praises of Ben Morrison game in and game out for just how dominant he's been this season. Goes down with an injury that, felt like a potentially, demoralizing situation, a real leader, an All-American, a guy that everyone's looking up to. And this defense just didn't skip a beat. And there's now another guy surging that I'm just putting into the bucket that when he's on the field, I key in and just say, forget the other 21 guys in the field. I'm just focused on what is Riley Mills doing. And the last few games, and especially in this one, he has just been the definition of havoc. He had 7 pressures in this game. The entire Notre Dame defense had 15 pressures. Half of the havoc that we were generating, half of the forced missed throws for Pyron that we were able to generate were coming from Riley Mills. That led to 2 sacks. I even feel like Howard Cross, you're not maybe seeing it in the stats as much. I think he only had 1 tackle in this game, but really felt like he's been returning to form. Sounds like he had a hamstring injury earlier in the year that's kind of slowing him down a little bit. But if Riley Mills and Howard Cross are truly peaking at the right time of the season, it's almost like that's getting a guy back from injury, right? Like when you have your captain, when you have your, maybe second team All American type players start elevating throughout the year, start getting healthy, start getting over some, early injury or early season bumps and bruises that maybe didn't keep them out of the lineup, but you just tell they were a little off. We didn't see this level of performance from Riley Mills or Howard Cross in the first couple games of the year where they were just taking over football games. Riley Mills took over this football game. Really fun to see him play.
Totally agree. So these were really strong players for us last year. There were preseason All-American expectations for these two guys, Mills and Cross, coming into the season. And we're finally starting to see them hit that potential, right? It took a few games, as you mentioned, Brett, but now part of the reason that we're seeing such an uptick in the havoc rate has been because these guys have been surging. I mean, Mills was just, especially at the end of the game, it was impossible to miss him. He was showing up so obviously, like pressuring the quarterback, and he's a defensive tackle. He was just like blowing right by these guys, getting to the quarterback. I think he had like a sack. He might have had like 2 sacks right at the end of the game or something like that. But it was like in close succession. So these guys are making a huge impact. In terms of the upside that I saw for this defensive unit at the beginning of the year. A lot of it was dependent on these two guys taking a step. And while they didn't get there initially at the beginning of the year, they're finally getting there now. So this is, I think, a key factor for us moving forward is that we have such a disruptive force now in the interior defensive line. Now, I think another thing that's related to that, and this is an area that at times we've been a little bit weaker on. I think weaker is, you got to put that in perspective here, because our defense as a whole has been extremely elite. But the one area that you could nitpick a little bit at various games this year has been our run game. And this game, I would say we really, like we answered the question about havoc 5 weeks ago, we answered the question about our run defense in this game as well. So we just gave up 64 yards on the ground, just 2.2 yards per carry. A lot of that's due to our interior defensive line, Cross, Riley Mills, and at the front seven as a whole dominate here. I think another important stat to mention here is that if you exclude sacks and get more of like the real number in terms of what we're giving up on a typical run play, if you exclude the sacks, the yards per carry was 3, and the yards after contact was 3, which tells you that the Georgia offensive line was generating absolutely no push. And I think you have to point out that the Georgia Tech offensive line is a very experienced offensive line. This isn't a bunch of freshmen. I think what's telling here is just how impressive our defensive line here was, just giving them absolutely nothing. So I don't know about you. I can't recall any game where I have seen a lack of push to this extent from an offensive line. And like you mentioned before, Howard Cross, it's not like he was flying off the stat sheet this game, but I think you really see the impact of his play in that run defense.
For sure. I mean, a typical yards before contact is about 2.5, and then yards after contact is about 2.5 to 3. It's like a good kind of yards per rush for a college football team is around 5.5 yards. 0 yards before contact. And Georgia Tech has been one of the best running offenses. Like we talked about that going into this game. That is a little bit of strength on strength, weakness on weakness, or where like their weakness is throwing the ball, while our strength is passing the ball. So okay, like they're probably not going to throw it a ton, but their strength is running the football, and it just had nothing going in this game, and it speaks to our tackling. There's so many areas of this defense that we could speak to, and I think tackling. I was actually talking about this while watching the game with my father-in-law this weekend. That everyone remembers the missed free throws. Like you can be an 80% free throw shooter and everyone's going to remember the one you miss in the fourth quarter. I think missed tackles is like that stat where everyone remembers the missed tackle. We had 8 missed tackles in this game for a 14% missed tackle rate. over the course of the year, that's a top 10 rate to be at. And we've been at that level all year long. We're one of the best tackling teams in the country. And, only having 8 missed tackles in a game versus the tune of, probably closer to 15 to 20 is what you want to avoid. It was just another strong day at the offense and the depth. There's so many guys making impact. Like Drake Bowen looked like an absolute star in this game. I think he led the defense with a Pro Football Focus grade of 90. Maybe he was second to Riley Mills. Osbury, Sneed, Viliamu, Asa, Jack Kaiser. I feel like we have done Jack Kaiser such a disservice on our show this year. He had another strong Pro Football Focus grade of 88. And Pro Football Focus grades we talk about a lot. We like Pro Football Focus for their stats like missed tackles, yards before and after contact, like getting into some real numbers and data. Their grades are subjective, but I saw on a tweet this week that Jack Kaiser is now the top defender in the country on rushing Pro Football Focus grades on rush defense. Any position, defensive line, linebacker, secondary, you name it. He's the best run defender in college football in terms of how he's grading out on Pro Football Focus. Even if that's subjective and even if that's not like a hard stat to lean on, I think it's telling how fundamentally sound he is as a player. And there's so many guys that are contributing that may not have Jalen Smith stats. They may not be flying all over that. Like they may not be, setting sack records for Notre Dame, but they are day in and day out just being solid playmakers with an Al Golden scheme. It's working so incredibly well that I just I want to savor every single one of these defensive games because they are just lights out as a unit. My one question on this game: how much do you think this is attributable to Haynes King? He was day to day throughout the week. When we covered the preview, we didn't even mention the injury because it felt like he was trending towards playing. Obviously, he then did not play with a shoulder injury. He's clearly the central point of Georgia Tech's offense. How much of this game should Notre Dame fans be like, sure, but it was against the backup?
Well, I can tell you what Vegas thought the impact was. So we were talking about the spread leading up to this game. And so it was about a 7.5 point spread before the news that Haynes King was not going to play came out. And then at that point, then it moved to 14.5. So Vegas sees the impact of Haynes King as about a touchdown. That is definitely significant. 7 points is a lot, but I think watching this game, it was such a thorough dismantling from our team, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I'm sure Haynes King would have helped make it a little bit closer, but I don't see a scenario here where Georgia Tech is going to be able to move the ball substantially downfield, way more than what they did. Maybe their success rate's a little bit better. Maybe Haynes King's able to avoid some of these disruptive plays that we were able to do, but I don't see a scenario where they're winning. I don't see a scenario where they're getting within a touchdown, frankly. I think you also have to point out that Pyron, he's not your typical backup. There's not as big of a drop off to him as there would be in other scenarios. He's someone who's been in the system for a while. He was a former starter. He even started pretty strong against us. And I mentioned earlier, their offensive line is very experienced. They have had an effective run game, which part of that's definitely due to Haynes King because he's very effective as a mobile quarterback. But I do think there is a drop off, but it's not enough to where, especially after watching this game, I would say that he would be able to give Georgia Tech the opportunity to actually make this game, a game where I'm sweating quite a bit and thinking that we could actually lose.
Yeah, if Vegas is saying he's worth a touchdown, the way I think about it is they had one touchdown in pure garbage time, and we had our walk-ons in the game. I mean, like we were just looking like a confused defense with just not even the second string. Like we were down to the fourth string. So they scored 7 points when the game was, close. So they score 14 with Haynes King, right? Like it's not like Haynes King is going to go and add 28 points to the scoreboard. So I agree. I think it makes it a little harder to evaluate. I think you definitely have to discount the performance a little bit because of that. But also, we've been doing this all year. We've been doing this against Louisville. We've been doing this against Texas A&M. We've been doing this against every team we've played. And I just think another example that if you're going to go score 20 points on Notre Dame, you're going to need a lot of turnover luck. You're going to need a lot of fluky stuff from our offense to put our defense in a bad position. Like if you have to just go and march up and down the field against Al Golden's defense, good luck. Moving
Yep.
to the other side of the ball, I know it's so fun to always start with the defense for just how dominant they've been. The offense is starting to come into form. SP Plus now thinks this is a top 20 offense throughout the course of the season. It was around 30 to 35 in the earlier stretches. It still feels like it's a bit of a mixed bag. And I'm curious your thoughts on this, Mike, but I can put it in a bunch of different areas. Our offensive line didn't allow a sack in this game. Some of that's because Riley Leonard's a mobile quarterback and is hard to break down, but that's a good day in the office for the offensive line. But in the run game, we only generated 1.4 yards before contact. As I mentioned, Georgia Tech generated zero. So, okay, we had more push from the Georgia Tech, but you need that number to be in the 2.5 range to really have a humming run game going. And we were 1.4. Not much push in the run game. Did grade out very well run blocking. Riley Leonard was pretty darn efficient for huge stretches of this game. He completed 81% of his throws that were 9 yards or shorter to the line of scrimmage. Very efficient in that area, but was 1 for 4 on throws over 20 yards. Very inefficient, struggled with the deep ball, including the very bad interception. It just kind of every part of this game felt like just a mixed bag on offense. Where do you shake out on it? Like, is this another step in the right direction? Is this another proof of concept like Purdue, like Stanford, where it's like, yep, we're going where we want to go? You can kind of see it all coming together. Or do you leave this game maybe with a little more uncertainty on the offensive side and more questions than answers?
I think I'm about where I was before the game. I don't think it was a step back because I think the stretches where our offense was efficient. So there were, I think it was three straight drives where we had touchdowns. It was between like it was in the second and third quarter, I think. But in those stretches, we got a view of what our offense can look like when it's really firing on all cylinders. And I think that's the potential for this offense. We just haven't been able to do it consistently because we got off to a slow start, and then as we'll talk about more in the fourth quarter, we were completely stagnant. So you're right, it is a mixed bag, but I definitely saw the potential, and I think I think if I'm going to talk about some areas that I hope that we can improve on to just give us a little more consistency as the season goes on. I think one area you want to start is the run blocking. A lot of our yards on the ground has come from Riley Leonard making fantastic plays on his legs or with his legs, and then Jeremiah Love and Jerry Price doing the same thing. If we can get our run blocking to take a step to the next level, you mentioned the push that we got. It's not very impressive, but if we can get them to do a little bit more there, I think we'll be able to get a little bit more consistent because we're still generating big runs. It's just I feel like there are quite a few plays where we're only getting anywhere from 0 to 2 yards, and they're not successful plays, and then it puts us in a difficult position, second and third down, and then we'll stall out. So I think if we can get a little bit better there, a little more yardage, I think that'll help prevent us from stalling out in some of these scenarios. I think Riley Leonard, yeah, it's interesting because there were stretches in this game where he looked really good. You mentioned some of his stats, Brett. I think what I have liked from him is it seems like we're figuring out in the passing game some things that he does well. So there were a couple run pass options that we ran again where we ran a quick slant and Leonard read it perfectly. It seems like that is a very difficult play for the defense to defend, and it seems like that's something that we're going to keep doing more and more. So that seems like something we've discovered. The deep ball is still a bit of a struggle, as you mentioned, Brett. Although it is better than it was earlier in the year, which is not saying a whole lot. Um, that is an area for upside. I think it's just if we can get the run blocking to take a step up, that'll give us more consistency in the run game. And then I think I still feel like Riley Leonard is on an upward trajectory. I think the point that we had made, I don't know, I can't remember what week it was, but we were talking about it might have been after one of his bad performances. We were talking about like, well, hey, you have to keep in mind he might be pretty rusty. He missed a lot of last season. He missed spring ball. He missed some of the summer. Like we may just be seeing him kind of work off some of the rust. I think there is an element of that going on here too. I don't think there's anything I saw from him that would make me think that he's not still on an upward trajectory. Now he didn't. I wouldn't say that he made a big jump from Stanford to this week. I feel like he looked really impressive against Stanford, and then right now I feel kind of about the same. I feel kind of about the same. It would have been nice to see a big uptick, kind of in that trajectory, but didn't happen this week, which is fine. Not everything's linear. I think one area that he's really effective is in the red zone. We were texting about this during the game. It's, I think, not having really had an extremely effective dual threat quarterback in many years. I don't think I necessarily appreciated until this year about how much of a difference that makes in your red zone efficiency. It feels like anytime we got the ball within 15 yards of the red zone of the end zone, it just feels like we're going to score. It just feels like the difficulty that it is for the defense to defend Riley Leonard and all the different options that we can go with associated with that. It just makes it, I don't know, it just almost feels like a short bet that we're going to be able to score. So I think that that's one thing that's really nice. I think, you know, I think, I think one area hopefully Leonard can improve a bit more is under pressure. That's one area where he still has a big drop off. And actually, in this game, he struggled quite a bit, even just against blitzes. So not even necessarily just against pressure, but whenever they sent a blitz, it seemed like he struggled. That's an area where I'm hoping he can improve a little bit because that's just if you read what the defense is doing a little bit better, you should be able to find opportunities. So I think that's something that I'm going to be looking for moving forward. But yeah, I mean, Brett, I think like you said, I think mixed bag is probably the right way to put it. Not a step back, definitely not a step back, but I think after Stanford, I was hoping that we would just be, all cylinders are running. We're like the train's moving fast. We figured out the offense. We're feeling pretty good, but it kind of felt like we didn't take the next big step yet. But I'm still hopeful that we will.
So I had three questions I wanted to ask us that were all in the lens of if Notre Dame loses a game the rest of the way, what happened? What is the recurring theme that we might be seeing now? Like we kind of reference, we discount, we're like, yeah, but everything else went so great and the defense is so dominant and we have a winning formula and it works. But if we lost, we'd say, you know what? We should have been talking about that more. We should have seen that coming. That was there in the Stanford game. That was there in the whatever game. That was there in this Georgia Tech game. What are those things? And so the first topic I came up with, and so I think it's in response to everything you were just talking about, was it just seems a little shakier than Stanford and Purdue in terms of this, like the proof of concept. And I've got that in a couple of areas related mostly to play calling and mostly to Riley Leonard trusting the play calling, trusting his protection, and getting through reads more quickly. And I think this is still a guy that hasn't played a lot of football quarterback between the injuries, more of a dual threat guy. Like he's kind of this quote unquote developmental QB that keeps being said about him. I think you see it in some of these reads. So throughout the course of the season, he is completing about 35% of his passes when he's under pressure. And that's right about where he was in this Georgia Tech game. When he's under pressure, he really struggles. And everyone struggles when they're under pressure. Clearly, you're not going to complete 70% of your passes and have 10 touchdowns and no interceptions when you're under pressure. There's going to be a drop off. That's why pressure is so important for defenses to generate. But the drop off to 35% is massive. In fact, his pro football focus grade, again, I get it's directional, but it's a 41. Like replacement level grade is 60, 50 is bad. Riley Leonard is 41 compared to other quarterbacks when he's under pressure. Massive, massive, like red flag to me that if other teams generate pressure, Riley Leonard, like I think there's this persona of, well, yeah, but he'll scramble and he'll drop the play in the dirt and he'll extend plays. That's not happening. When he's under pressure, he is not extending plays and making things happen. He's making things happen with his legs when he reads an opening in the defense and just takes off early and kind of keeps the defense honest. The other area that I've just been talking about for years on this show is the use of play action. It seems like Riley Leonard does a really great job when called to use the pass in RPO. Freeze that defensive line, freeze that linebacker, um, you know, just somewhere in there, hold up the defense and not let them bottle up the box so much. It felt like Georgia Tech was just loading up the box and said, beat us with the pass. And we kept running it. and we weren't using play action. We only used play action on 20% of throws. Against Stanford, that was in the 40s. Like play action was a huge part of the Stanford game. And I don't know if we're just not calling play action because we're just, not calling it because we saw something that said, hey, it's not going to work against Georgia Tech or not. We're the offense. We got to dictate terms. Like if you look at Tennessee or Ole Miss or some of the other programs, LSU in some prior years, the teams that are using play action as a staple of their RPO, it doesn't matter who they're going up against. Like the RPO with the pass as a central tenet is their identity. And it's working, I think, pretty well for us in these last few games. We talk about all the slant throws. We talk about Riley Leonard being 81% completion rate on throws less than 9 yards. Well, get more of those off of play action, but we're really inconsistent in it. Against Stanford, we did it a ton and it was super effective. At Georgia Tech, we just completely went away from it. So there's just an inconsistency there in something with Denbrock, something with Leonard, being comfortable under pressure, getting through reads, trusting in play action as a staple of the offense. That if you told me we lost the game because like we just were super stagnant on offense, I'd say I bet we called play action 10% of the time. I bet Riley Leonard completed 30% of his passes under pressure. And I bet that led to the team loading up the box and limiting us in the run. Like you can kind of see the formula that we got away with in this game, but for stretches of the game, you could see us get bottled up. That's my concern. My question back to you, Mike, pivoting for the other thing that's hanging over my head, and I have struggled with what the answer is here. I've gone back and forth on it. At some point, do we lose a game because we don't have Ben Morrison? At some point, do we lose a game because our best player isn't on the field?
It's a good question, and I don't know that there's an easy answer for it. We might not lose another game in the regular season. I think our schedule shapes up favorably. I think our defense is good enough to where we may be fine. I do think if we make it to the playoff and we're playing against Tennessee or someone like that, that's really where the loss of Ben Morrison is going to show up. But certainly, if we're not having our best day in the office, say our offense bogs down for some of the reasons that you're mentioning, and we don't have Ben Morrison to just completely lock down the opposing offense. We're allowing a few more plays than we would otherwise. That's where it could hurt. So I do think the defensive unit as a whole, we both talked about, we're very positive on it, and I think even losing someone like Ben Morrison, this is still a really effective unit. It's still one of the top units in the country, top five. Still, as we mentioned before, I think it still has a chance to be a top three unit, or maybe even number one. But not having a corner that you can just put on an elite wide receiver and shut him down, that's definitely going to hurt at some point. I don't know if it's going to be in the regular season, but we'd be more likely to see that in the playoffs should we make it. I think some stats here I'm going to mention though, just to frame how our defense performed in this game, our pass defense in particular. So 7 yards per attempt. That's what so very stingy. So not if you're looking at that, I would say there's not really any cause for concern. Georgia Tech clearly targeted Leonard Moore, who's targeted 9 times, gave up 5 catches for 105 yards, gave up a 60-yard play. But if you watch that play, Watts really needs to, and Watts generally has played phenomenally this year, but that's a play where ideally he would be able to help out his corner a little bit more and help limit that big play. But I think overall, Leonard Moore's not he's a good player. Look, the guy's a true freshman. I think he held up pretty well, given that a team is trying to completely isolate and expose him. And I don't think he allowed that to happen. He gave up a couple plays, but I think our defense is still going to function pretty well with him stepping in. I think Leonard Moore is likely going to be a future star of this team if he's playing at this level as a true freshman. I think I think we found our next stud corner. He's not quite at that level yet, but yeah, I think I'm pleased with where he's at right now. It's just going to be a question of if we face an elite offense at some point, are they going to be able to get a little bit more yards on us than we would have otherwise with Ben Morrison? I mean, Christian Gray, he still played well, only targeted 3 times, so clearly they were trying to avoid him. 2 catches for 16 yards, so pretty good day in the office. It's also, you got to note that there's some garbage time stats here that kind of skew these stats a little bit. But I think big picture, we only gave up 13 points against Georgia Tech. So it's just again another stingy performance by the defense. Um, Now you could, if you want to nitpick, you could say there were two field goals maybe Georgia Tech should have had. There were two interceptions by a guy who was the backup quarterback, and the run game was maybe more stagnant than it would have been because of the backup quarterback that they have. So otherwise, we could have given up more points. But as we mentioned before, it's an experienced offensive line. This backup quarterback is better than what you typically have in a backup quarterback in this type of situation. And we're dominant for really most of the game, other than just the start. Pressures on 30% of dropbacks. Um, and I think overall, I think it was a really strong defensive performance. So I'm not concerned about our defense having a big drop off. It's more just if you want to compete at the highest level, if you want to win a couple playoff games, if you want to actually be a national championship contender, you really need your Ben Morrisons in that situation, and that's where it's going to
Mhm.
sting. So I guess I threw out a lot of stats here, a lot of rationale, but if I had to just boil it down in one sentence, I kind of got at this at the beginning. It's we're going to be fine for the regular season. We should be fine for the regular season, but you may see this impact against an elite offense in the playoff.
For sure. I mean, the one caveat in that is USC, averages throwing the ball for 290 yards a game. On the year, Notre Dame has only allowed 160 yards passing per game. Before this game against Georgia Tech, we've only let someone go over 200 yards passing once all year against Louisville. So this game was the most passing yards we've given up, but it's complemented by giving up 64 rushing yards. It was very clear what we were taking away in this game. And so, sure, did Leonard Moore give up 5 catches for 105 yards? Yes. Did I wish that he didn't have the missed tackle along with Xavier Watts on the 60-yard big play? Yes. But are those going to lead to us losing a game? Maybe USC, but I think everything else you were saying seems like the right assessment. The third thing that I've been thinking a lot about last week on the show, Michael and I talked about slow starts. And in this game, it wasn't exactly the slow start, although it was. We are once again trailing, I think 7-0 into
Yep.
the second quarter. So
Yep.
another slow start and stagnant offensive stretches. Our defense just kept giving the ball back to our offense in the fourth quarter to just say, go get 2, 3 first downs and end the game. Our special teams had a fake punt and a fake field goal to also lead towards, guys, just go end the game. Go get 2, 3 first downs with Jeremiah Love or Riley Leonard or however you want to do it and end the game. And we had a 22% success rate in the fourth quarter. Now, I'll caveat the first quarter, we actually had a good success rate of 44%. That interception really threw us off, and Georgia Tech had a really long drive that ate up a bunch of clocks. I think we only had 2 possessions in the first quarter. And so, I think from a stats perspective, we even said this about Stanford. Statistically, we're coming out strong on offense. It's not like we're coming out with a bunch of 3-and-outs and we aren't moving the ball and we aren't showing any signs of life. I actually think the numbers are maybe a little misleading on these slow starts, but there are stretches of just stagnant offense that just doesn't get going. In fact, 21 of the points we had in this game until very late with the pick six at the end by the defense was on 3 straight drives in the middle of the game to end the first quarter and or to end the second quarter and to start the third quarter. Other than those 3 drives that were bang, bang, bang after the Riley Leonard interception, we didn't put points on the board as an offense. And again, I'd say the same thing. Can you get away with a stagnant stretch against UVA or Florida State or Navy? Probably. Can you get away with a stagnant stretch against USC? I think that the answer is probably. Can you get away with a stagnant stretch against Oregon or Georgia? No. Like you just can't go a quarter and a half of not doing anything on offense and expect to hang in those games, or you're going to look like Texas. Texas played toe to toe with Georgia for 2.5 quarters, and for a quarter and a half, they didn't show up on offense, and Georgia won the game. That is my concern with this team right now. Of the 3 things we've talked about, Ben Morrison and Riley Leonard and Dan Brock kind of continuing to gel as the season goes along. I feel pretty good. I feel great about where our defense is at. I feel great about the trajectory of Den Brock and Leonard. But these stagnant stretches, I think, is tied into the Leonard Denbrock play calling progressions, that conversation. It's got me a little nervous in the conversation of if Notre Dame gets to the playoff, will we cause some damage? Mike, one more question for you. I alluded to it: fake field goal and a fake punt with a big lead in the fourth quarter. ESPN could not stop talking about Notre Dame's playoff probability and Notre Dame's playoff resume. Talk about needing to fill airtime. I want everyone to hear you right now. Notre Dame's resume beating Texas A&M, would be wins against Navy, would be wins against Army. It's a totally great resume to make the playoff at 11-1. We have a 63% chance to make the playoff because we have about a 60% chance to win out. If we win out, we are in the playoff. Period. Full stop. The media talking heads are just silly nonsense. Like, just move on. Go back to talking about football. But it's a little weird to have a big fourth quarter halftime lead and call a fake field goal and a fake punt. In fact, I think Brent Keys and Georgia Tech might have been a little irked about it. I think that's why they had their starters in. I thought that was the weirdest thing in the game. It was so clear their backup quarterback was like getting beat up by Notre Dame, and Georgia Tech was like, no, we're running you out there for one more hit, two more hits, three more hits, because we're going to score to prove a point. I think part of that was from these special team fakes. What was your take on that, Mike? Did Notre Dame go too far? Did Marcus Freeman, cross the, unspoken, written coaching rules?
I don't think so. Look, I think some of these fakes were technically you could say Georgia Tech still had a shot if right, like the game wasn't entirely over. I think that's something that you could lean on if you wanted, right? Now, look, I think you're stretching that logic a bit. I think another element with Marcus Freeman is he is aware that there is a publicity battle with these rankings. It's a committee, like they're going to have their subjective biases. So you don't want to give them any ammunition to use against you. So I think that's something that's in his mind. He knows that our schedule is not the strongest schedule we've ever had. We have the lost NIU. So to the extent that when the committee gets together and they can't just point at a couple games and be like, oh, wow, Notre Dame playing down to their level of competition on top of that NIU loss. Yeah, you know what? Let's knock them down a couple pegs. I think that's what's going through his mind a bit. And it is a bit of a shame that that's where we're at right now in college football. And that's where I think we have been there for a while is there's a lot of college football. The committee, frankly, doesn't have time to watch every single game. So they may not always have context on what's going on in every scenario. So you do have to win the publicity battle to some extent. I think that's what he's doing. I think he's response, it's Brent Keys, right?
Mm-hmm.
Georgia Tech coach. Brent
Mm-hmm.
Keys. Yeah, I think his reaction, I understand it.
Singular, a single key, Brent Key.
Single key. Brent single key. Okay. Coach Key. I think his reaction, I understand why he reacted that way, but you also have to be able to control your emotions a little bit better in that situation because the game was over when they were trying to put up garbage time points. There was not a scenario where Georgia Tech was going to win that game. And I think we had our backups in mostly at that point. So it was our backups versus their starters for that game. I guess it was a backup quarterback. And Brett, as you mentioned, they were getting walloped pretty bad. Like, yeah, it was. There were multiple people on Twitter, a lot of people on Twitter, just saying, "What the heck are they doing?" There's this guy's getting annihilated out there. Like it looked like he hurt his hand at one point. Their quarterback. So I think he's got to control his emotions a little bit better there because he was putting his players in an unnecessarily risky scenario. Right? They definitely didn't need to be taking any sort of injury risk there. Hopefully everyone's okay, but I thought. I don't know. I think to me, like if I were him, I would, it would cross my mind that, oh, Notre Dame is trying to make this look like it's like, okay, the game's not entirely over, but it basically is. But Notre Dame, yeah, they're the playoff contender. They're trying to make this look a little bit better than it would otherwise. And I think if you were to think about that, you probably wouldn't have as much of a tantrum as he actually ended up doing. So maybe tantrum's putting it a little bit strongly, but I would say he
Yeah, we
looked
have
pretty.
no reason to believe he. I don't know if he said anything in an interview. I don't know if he just wanted to do the play calling because he's a tough, hard nosed football that says we're playing to the end of the game. But
Yeah.
it felt a little retaliatory. The other thing, Freeman came out in the press conference and said, we saw a flaw in Georgia Tech special team coverages in film. This was a Georgia Tech specific read. And so this was something we were either going to use against Georgia Tech, or if we do other fakes this year, it's probably not those. Like we didn't run those fakes until we designed them in practice this week. And so it's not like we were, using all of our bells and whistles and pulling out all the stops for Georgia Tech. We had a specific read. If you told me one of them was 4th and 4 from around the 40, like that's go for it territory in football. Like they're finally listening to the data nerds like us and going for it in those fourth and mid yardage situations. And so if you'd have just said we lined up for it to go for it on 4th and 4 to try to convert a first down and just keep running the clock, everyone would have said, oh, okay. If we thought we had a highly successful play drawn up on the fake field goal or the fake punt, I don't know if that's really any different. And
Yeah.
so the fake field goal a little later on in the game was 4th and 4. I think that's go for it territory. 4th and 8 earlier on the Jeremiah Love reverse sweep. That was, I think, still 10, 11 minutes left in a game that's 24-7. To your point, that game's not over. And so I didn't take much issue with it. I haven't seen a ton of press on it. It is interesting. These coaches now more willing to go for it on fourth down. I think you're going to be, and needing to prove out a resume for the playoff. I think you're going to be in a little bit more of a situation where you're going to see some teams run up scores. And I think that's just part of college football now. And that's just part of, again, needing to pass the eye test. I don't take any issue with that. I don't take any issue with someone does that against Notre Dame. Like that's just part of the game of football. So that being said, let's move on to our Navy preview. This is a ranked, undefeated Navy team. And I will foreshadow this segment by saying, but it's overrated. A very weak schedule, middle of the pack in the efficiency stats. However, a pretty fun Navy narrative and some tweaks to what Notre Dame fans are used to seeing, particularly out of the offense, that I think makes this a really fun matchup. I love Navy for the tradition. I think we should keep playing it for the rivalry and what it means for college football and the connection between Notre Dame and our military academies. But I've never enjoyed this game. And I think in recent years, we've gotten better about avoiding injuries. We've gotten better about avoiding this as a trap game. But it's just not fun to watch the option. It's just not fun to watch someone go out there and just stall for 60 minutes. Like that's what this is. It's a stall offense. And the new Navy offense has a couple of tweaks where the new coaching staff that's come in since Kenya Matalolo has left. I forget now how to pronounce his name after he's not the coach anymore. But former coaches, I don't think they require Malort shots. But the new coaching staff has come in and said, we're going to mix this up a little bit. We're still going to be the traditional wing tee option, but we're going to bring in elements of the spread option. And specifically, we're going to target throwing the ball 20 to 25% of the time. They publicly said this in the offseason, and they're currently at 22.6%. So they aren't messing around. Like they are here to throw the ball 1/4 of the time, and they are to do it for sheer like explosiveness only. Like this is their every time they throw the ball, they are looking for deep shots. And we'll get into it as we go, but they're completing passes to the tune of like 20 yards a catch. Like when they're completing passes, it is their chunk plays, and it's bringing a game of explosion to the historical Navy triple option. I'm excited just as a football fan to watch it. I think it's a new take on an old offense that I think is an interesting thing that I haven't necessarily seen done well to this level of effect, and excited for that game. Mike, it all starts with the quarterback play. Walk us through Navy's quarterback that's really helming the ship, pun intended.
For sure. And I think what you find when you look at the good Navy teams historically is that they have a good quarterback. A Navy team with a good quarterback is a completely different animal. And it looks like that's what we're going to be facing this year. So Blake Horvath, so he's pro football focus grades. We mentioned that these are not opponent adjusted. And Brett, you mentioned that Navy has had a pretty weak schedule so far. That being said, he's grading out for the season at 93, which I think regardless of who you're playing, that is still a very impressive grade. That's elite. That's beyond elite, honestly. And he's very effective in the run, obviously 93 running grade. But he's also effective passing ball. So 78 grade passing. So that's not elite, but that's still really, really good. So this is a guy who is effective in the run game, but he's also effective. He also knows what he's doing in the passing game as well. So on those passing stats, 64% completion percentage, 888 passing yards, with 12 yards per attempt. So, Brett, as you mentioned, like a lot of these passes are deep throws with a lot of explosiveness, and you see that in that yards per attempt stat. And then 10 touchdowns.
By the
And
way, 10 touchdowns, more than Riley Leonard has.
yes, 10 passing touchdowns, man. I wish we had 10 passing touchdowns. And then on the ground, of course, he's very effective there as well. 621 rushing yards, 10 touchdowns on the ground, so that's 20 touchdowns total, and then basically 8 yards per carry on the ground. So this is someone who's just putting up a lot of stats across the board. He's going to be a tough guy. Again, a lot of this is against weaker competition, but clearly this is one of the better Navy quarterbacks. That as a fan, this will be one of the better Navy quarterbacks that we've seen.
For sure. And I think the interesting part about this passing game is it's not really the wide receivers. They only have 4 receptions to wide receivers on the year. In the offense, they talked a lot about getting tight ends more involved. It's not really that. We should think about this as kind of 3 or 4 running backs and fullbacks doing that same old option look, but in multiple directions. And one of them is looking to sneak out of the backfield and run a deep wheel route, run a deep post, run a deep seam, run like they're looking to use their running backs for those home runs. So a couple of examples, Eli Heidenrich, apologies if I got that one wrong, 23 catches on the year, their leading receiver, and he's going to the tune of 21 yards per catch as a running back. Their next leading catcher is also a running back. He's got 9 grabs in the year, also averaging 20 yards per catch. No one else on the team has more than 4 catches. So they're very much looking to use their running backs as gadget explosive plays in that passing game. And then after that, you mentioned Horvath, their leading rusher. Other than him, it is a true option. 6 different guys are averaging at least 3 touches per game. They're very balanced. And this looks like if you're gonna run the option, the formula is gonna be a high success rate to stay on schedule and keep churning out first downs. Low havoc. You're not passing that much. You're diving forward on, so many of the run plays. Like you shouldn't really be getting tackled for loss if you're running the option well. And it's churning out 4 or 5 yard carries. The surprising thing, so let me start there. In those 2 areas, they are third in the country in success rate at 54%. Every other play, they're staying on schedule. They're ninth in havoc allowed, so teams just aren't disrupting them. It's really hard to go and disrupt that triple option. The surprising part is that they're 42nd in explosiveness with the new wrinkles of this passing game. So not top 10 explosion, not, blowing the doors off the secondary. They're not doing it, 50, 60, 70 times a game, but they're not last in the country in explosion. They actually have that real threat to open up a game. And so I think this is a dangerous offense. I think this is a really dangerous test for Al Golden, where you've got a team that stays on schedule really well and doesn't get disrupted with havoc. That is, regardless of offensive scheme, a really good formula for offenses to go put points on the board and control a game. And you add to it the passing attack we're talking about. It's I think, a really interesting test for Al Golden. But we got to talk about their schedule. It's one of the worst schedules in college football. Their toughest opponent so far this year is Memphis, number 59 in the SP Plus. They've only played 4 other FBS opponents, and they're all ranked 119th or worse out of 134 teams. So sure, other than Memphis, they've blown out everybody they've played, but these are all some of the worst teams in college football on their schedule. And I think that's a huge element where you look at those stats, and I think you just got to question all of them. So the toughest defense they've faced is Memphis, 76th in SP plus. Notre Dame is a top 5 defense. Navy hasn't seen anything this year to Notre Dame's caliber on talent, on productivity, on staying assignment correct, on tackling. You go through all of the things that make it really hard for a triple option to work. And I think Notre Dame is just a test that, Navy just hasn't seen this year.
Totally agree. If this was 2016, peak, I guess before he got fired, peak Brian Van Gorder defense. And you said, hey, we're playing Navy. They have a really good quarterback. And guess what? They figured out a way to incorporate explosiveness. I think I'd probably have a stroke if you had told me that. But for this year, it's different. So their offense is looking really good, as you said, Brett. They've been really effective, but it's against this weak competition. And and I think the key thing for me is that we have a really good defense. And when Notre Dame has a really good defense, I would say the option teams, we tend to kind of nip that in the bud pretty early. We tend to take care of business. So I'm overall feeling pretty good about this game. I think, yeah, look, I think Navy's, it's always a stressful game. It can be very frustrating at times. You just don't get as many possessions. But I think our team is built, even if this is a particularly good Navy team, and we don't really know exactly how good they are yet. Like SP plus, right? They're 64th. Florida State's 69th. So again, that's where you see that weak schedule. It's like, yeah, they're beating up bad teams, but in terms of the advanced stats don't peg them as a top team. So I think this is a game where we should take care of business. I think if you're looking at Vegas, Vegas says that they're 13 and a half point favorites, which one thing you have to keep in mind with um, with spreads with Navy is that the spreads are always going to be smaller than they would be otherwise, just because of the option, uh, the option style of play. There just are fewer possessions. So SP plus, for instance, it implies closer to 20, but because neither team is going to get as many possessions, that shrinks that spread down to 13 and a half. So I think that sounds about right to me. This feels like a game that we should be able to handle. I think Navy's defense, right? They've been okay. They've been solid. The ball control certainly helps them. Um, Memphis, that's the best offense they played. They're 34th on an offense in SP plus, but no one else in the top 90. And Memphis put up 44 points. So I think this is a defense that shouldn't give our offense too much trouble. Hopefully, we don't stagnate too much. I think our defense, more importantly, should be able to hold in check this new look Navy offense. I guess we can. I'm kind of jumping into predictions here now, Brett. But I think from my standpoint, if I'm giving a prediction here, I to me 28-14 sounds about right. I think our offense is going to flounder a little bit, not too much. I think it'll be similar. I think we'll have some stretches where we look good. I think we'll have some stretches where we stagnate a bit, but I think they do enough. And then I think also importantly, I think our defense special teams helps us out here. I think they put us in a good position. They keep Navy in check. I think generally we hold this iteration of the option. I think we keep it down a bit. The point I keep mentioning, I think the main point I keep coming back to is that I always feel good against Navy when our defense is strong.
For sure. I've got no. I've been wrestling with this one. I've changed my prediction around the same number the whole time. I've got Notre Dame 34-14, so I'm a little more bullish than you are, and I think it's the same thing. I wouldn't be surprised if they break a couple. I wouldn't be surprised if they also haven't been playing really tough competition. And so if they've been saving up some of their own trickery, some of their own looks, some of their own, you know, schemes and disguises and wrinkles that they're saving for this game. This is their biggest game of the year, other than maybe Army just because of that rivalry. And so I would be surprised if there's some gadgets that hold us up, if it's frustrating for a period of time. But I just think our front seven is so dominant. It's so experienced. Jack Kaiser, Riley Mills, Howard Cross, they've seen this. This isn't their first rodeo with Navy. So I've got Notre Dame winning this one comfortably, and moving on with a win. So until next week, Gyrish beat Midshipman.
Irish beat Midshipmen.